Hello there and welcome to this vlog of June 2023, and today's episode is going to be rather spicy because I'm going to give a relatively contrarian viewpoint to a very popular and very famous BattleTech thing, which is the clan invasion. I often think that the way the clan invasion is perceived by the community is wrong. Which I'll obviously get into. I'm going to kind of draw up a little bit of a thesis here and then like delve down into it. But I say wrong with a very small W. I don't think what people are saying is intrinsically incorrect. I just think there is a misunderstanding of why the clan invasion failed as badly as it did, and it did fail really badly. Like, this is an event that should have just seen a monumental victory for the clans, but it didn't. So why wasn't that the case? Well, okay, before I get into it then, I'm just going to set some parameters for this, because this is again, if you know my style, you know that I just speak to camera. I literally have bullet point notes here, so I don't have any kind of script or anything like that. So, you know, I'll just blurb this out there, but to do that effectively, I really need to set some parameters just so you kind of understand where I'm coming from. First of all, I'm going to do a lot of cross-referencing to 20th century history. That's really the only starting point when you're doing a cross-analysis with BattleTech, because it's so inspired by 20th century history. There are other things in there as well, like the fall of Rome. I think there's a lot of Middle Age history as well in BattleTech. Maybe not purposefully, but certainly through osmosis, because the people who wrote initial BattleTech clearly had a good historical understanding. So the joy for me is really trying to like weave these threads out of BattleTech to kind of do that interesting analysis across our own history, because BattleTech is a wonderful setting. I mean, it's so rich and interesting, and you know, you might be into BattleTech just because of the mechs, which is obviously fine. You know, they are a very fun part of the universe, but for me, it's the richness of that galaxy, of all the geopolitics and the historical analogies, that kind of thing. That's what makes BattleTech really quite an amazing IP, and just so interesting and diverse. And there's obviously so many authors and viewpoints, and you know, the universities, or we'll say like the IP universe is growing quite significantly at the moment, as we saw from the last Kickstarter. So that's only going to improve. There are only going to be more ideas floating around. So this is one of those ideas, really. It's kind of a contrarian viewpoint on the clan invasion. And again, I said wrong with a small W. It's very much contrarian with a small c, because it's not... There will be people who absolutely agree with what I'm saying here, and people who disagree. But the people who agree with me will be like, well, it's not really a contrarian point of view, but I think it does go against the grain for what the zeitgeist is at the moment on the clans and everything that they kind of represent. And keep in mind, we're like, what, 30 years now after the invention of the clans. So they've had decades now to be explored and written about, and all that stuff. So this is more almost like a revisionist viewpoint. And I will go into a revisionist history on this and basically damn some of it, because revisionist history can be absolutely terrible. But this is really, ironically then, a revisionist viewpoint to some extent. Anyway, let's get into it. So this is how I view it, and this is how I think most people view what happened during the clan invasion. And it can be summed up by a maxim, a quote, whatever you want to say, which is, and it's something that, you know, historians use quite often, that quantity is a quality in of itself. And that basically underpins the entire argument for why the clans failed. That, comparatively speaking, the clans were a tiny force. I mean, you could like fit clan space and its population into like a tiny little segment of the inner sphere. So in terms of numbers, they were just like way like ridiculously smaller than the inner sphere. But that then comes into play, or the question then comes into play, well, why is it they even could challenge the inner sphere? And why is it, and the answer to that is obviously the technology was that good, and the Inner Sphere had literally forgotten most of everything it knew during the Succession Wars. They destroyed all their warships. So it just, it really was like, if you want to equate it to history, it's almost like a Napoleonic army going up against like a First World War army or something like that. Like the game had just changed, and the Inner Sphere just didn't know what hit them. Over time, though, and I'll delve into this as we go through this video here, but the Inner Sphere then had a chance to catch up, and when that kind of advantage for the clans was chipped away, basically, and not that the Inner Sphere ever got up to like parity with the clans during the invasion, but they had enough kind of nous to kind of create more interesting technologies and come up to some level that then the Inner Sphere really quite easily defeated the clans. And this was all over the space of, like 2.5 years. So it's not a vast period of time. And there were, caveats to the Inner Sphere technological advantage. So, for instance, the Inner Sphere had been in a renaissance period of technology. So the retrofitted clan invasion tech that they got was then much more easily adapted into their forces. Other things as well, and I might delve into this a little bit as we go on, but this is an important point. 2 of the powers within the Inner Sphere were untouched by the clan invasion. That's the Free Worlds League and the Capellans. The Free Worlds League in particular then became like a massive industrial base for all the Inner Sphere and just provided, just an incredible amount of weaponry and mechs to the Federated Commonwealth and to the Draconis Combine. And that, the clans didn't have that advantage. Right? They didn't have that massive industrial output base that the Inner Sphere had, and eventually just through weight of numbers and the attrition that weight of numbers gives you, even if you're not at the same quality level of your opponent, the Inner Sphere won. And that's kind of surmised across the end of the clan invasion, which is the Battle of Tukiid, where Comstar basically just used like industrial force of might plus another factor which we'll get into, which kind of backs my theory up, to defeat the clans. And it was literally that, like Tukiid was a complete meat grinder. Comstar expended an incredible loss there, but they ultimately won their objectives and won the war. My argument would be, and I'm not doing this for some kind of clickbaity reason. I'm not. That argument that I've just presented there is completely true. I'm not sat here saying, oh yeah, the quantity issue was not a factor during the clan invasion. It absolutely was. My issue is it was secondary to what I'm going to talk about next. And my theory revolves around the fact that the only thing that beat the clans was the clans. Or more specifically, rotten clan culture, which is not conducive to running anything like a successful warfare. Now, truth be told, that's my kind of theory on it as a priority, but the two of them combined, and I think most people would agree with that ridiculous clan culture and, the quantity factor are what basically defeated the clans. But I'm going to use a historical analysis using 20th century history to kind of say why I think the quantity factor is always overplayed. And to do that, I need to talk about 2 things here. So the first thing I need to talk about is soft power. Now, soft power is quite an eclectic concept, but it's hugely important. Most of you will know what soft power is, but just in case, soft power is like the power emitted from a nation or an area or a state or a military or whatever else it is because of the things that you can't quantify, right? But things that exist. So a great example is I'm doing this talk in English, obviously, as someone born in Britain. And I know from looking at my YouTube metrics that at least 15% of my audience originate from Germany and France and Spain and Italy and Japan, right? Now, but if they're watching me, they're probably not watching me with the subtitles of their own nation. I don't even know if YouTube can do that, especially with my accent. Don't know what it would spit out. Goodness knows. Probably more sense than I talk, to be fair. But regardless, the fact that I'm doing this in English and that there is a decent percentile of my audience who understand it, that's soft power. If I was French and doing these videos, my audience would be 99% French. Right? Like this, I mean, I say that, like you might get a few Germans watching or, but how many people in America who play BattleTech speak fluent French? Not many. That is Britain's massive soft power. That is the thing that we have really kind of given to the world. Other things as well, and any country has claim to stuff like this, but Britain has probably one of the greatest soft powers in world history, which, and I say that, I think we are starting to really diminish our soft power. Things like, over the last 10 years particularly, I think Britain's really kind of cut back on things that I think are insane. Like a really good example is the BBC News Service overseas. That they've just determined to get rid of. This is that is soft power that you can't buy. That's trusted media in foreign countries. Like if you just set up, I mean, we've got, you could say here, like in Britain, we have Al Jazeera, which is the Arab news network, which is a really quite trustworthy, good news source. So they're kind of filling that space now, right? Like, so you'd say, good for those areas of the world. They've learnt from the British in terms of what soft power is. So, and as we are diminishing it, going back 100 years, the Brits only cared about soft power, right? We didn't have a massive standing army. We had power in two areas, and our hard power was our navy, but our soft power was our commerce, our rule of law, sport. Sport still applies, by the way. I think that's the one soft power we really still have left with things like the Premier League, which just trumps all other football leagues, which I think is quite bizarre because I don't particularly like the Premier League, but hey ho, they've done a wonderful job marketing it, and it's a huge export for Britain. But now, or when you look back in history, you'll see that countries who have got genuinely huge levels of hard power and really, really terrible levels of soft power never succeed. The most famous example is obviously Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany had significant, in the early days anyway, but I'm going to go on to speak quite lengthy here about Germany in World War II. Very, very high levels of hard power. Especially you could say the World War One side of this, which I genuinely think, if you kind of look at things all considered, the World War One German army is one of the greatest armies in history. It's absolutely phenomenal. Again, obviously that army would be absolutely ruined by the modern American army, but I'm talking comparatively speaking. They were brilliant, excellent trained, huge, wonderful logistics capabilities. So they had hard power that ran back in time, and then they put a very odd psychopath in charge in the form of Hitler and his little cabal of idiots and evildoers, and effectively they ruined their own hard power to some extent, and they never had soft power to begin with, because Germany is not a country that really appreciates soft power. This goes for many continental countries. Not all of them. It's I think if you look at countries like Italy have a very good level of soft power, considering that they're not really they're not a country that had vast empires like say the French or the British or the Spanish did. Italians do it in food and culture, right? So that's their soft power. You don't really see that from Germany. And this is no slight on Germany. It's just a cultural idiosyncrasy, right? They are amazing at the industrial manufacturing, and they're notable for things like that. The hard power thing is their sell. It's why they probably never had an empire to begin with, or it's what kind of all kicked off World War One, because they don't really go in for that kind of touchy-feely stuff. When the touchy-feely stuff, like language and food, that's what people really care. That's what people will buy into. That's what people care about. And soft power again, going back to BattleTech, the clans had zero soft power. It was a rotten culture backed up by wonderful technology. And it's one of those situations where I think the clans, if they'd have won early, or if they'd have kind of done what, say, like Nazi Germany did early on in its victories and built on that, got through to terror and done it within 18 months, then that would have been it. The inner sphere would have capitulated. The clans then would have had a massive industrial power to draw back on themselves because of all the conquered territory and all the factories that came with that. But they didn't do that. And I think, again, I'm going to kind of delve into now why that, you know, in a little while anyway, in regards why that soft power, why those cultural issues become so fundamental to what's going on with any particular force, whether we're talking about a BattleTech, you know, future history, or whether we're talking about like real history in our own world. Another thing that I'd like to discuss though before I get into the I suppose like the theory and delving down into the theory and why I think the clans failed is we do need to talk about World War II for a second and what I would term revisionist histories around World War II. Now, what I'm going to say here doesn't directly apply to the clan invasion. In fact, it's the reverse, because we'll talk about technology quite a bit, but it's how things become skewered in people's minds, like over time, and then you kind of have this like notion, like what I'm saying here, that like because everyone is so obsessed with World War II, and then the revisionist histories are now kind of in the zeitgeist first place of what people assume the situation was. You then get this weird situation where people can't break free of it and people just relate back to it all the time, but that then means that they get out of date very quickly, because like the world now in 2023 is not 1940, right? Like how we would fight warfare now is wholly different from 1942, 1943, but because we are still clinging, or a lot of our experts are still clinging to what happened in World War II, and I see this everywhere. I mean, I keep up with, you know, like military industrial complex things because I find it quite interesting. And the amount of nonsense that circulates in that sphere by these so-called experts who are just utterly clueless because they read manuals going back into the 50s and 60s, never been able to break free of that, and then they taught a generation after that who then, you know, start parroting these same notions. And I do really believe that the quantity over quality thing is part of that problem, because now it's almost turned on its head. Like, you can win a warfare with software, soft power, which I've already discussed, and very high levels of quantity, like precision bombing, right? Cyber warfare. You know, just look at what's going on in Russia and Ukraine at the moment with the Russian invasion. Like, the Ukrainians which are a fraction the size of Russia when it comes to like the hard power side of it, and they weren't that well prepared for this war. They're getting there though, and it's shocking to me I shouldn't really do this because it makes it sound trivial, but like there are correlations between the clan invasion and what the Russians are currently doing. You know, it's like utter hubris based on, again, it's different because obviously the Russians have like a really industrial might behind them that the clans didn't have. They had the technological advantage, but the hubris and the lack of persuasion and soft power is something that's really coming into play now. But going back to World War II, sorry, I do tend to go off on tangents, as you well know, but going back to World War II, and I remember this because obviously I grew up in Britain. I'm 40, so when I was a kid, I knew many, many people. I mean, there was a British Legion like bar, pub, little event centre at the top of my street in a town called Pudsey, where I moved when I was about 10, something like that. So a lot of the people around me, it was quite a big military town. You know, my next door neighbour had fought in North Africa and was then stranded in Malta for something like 4 years or something like that when he was evacuated from North Africa as a casualty. You know, one of the, I used to call them like my auntie and uncle, but they weren't really my auntie and uncle. They were just like neighbours when I was growing up. He fought in World War II in Italy, literally up and down the entire region in what was one of the most brutal like warfares of the World War II arena. You know, so I knew these people growing up. I spoke to them. You know, I used to be fascinated by listening to their stories. And I remember one of these guys. It was actually the guy that was in Malta. Of quite a while. I remember him telling me that when they got back from the war, he just thought it was like an amazing adventure because he went out there when he was 19 years old. He was blown out of a tank in North Africa when he was relatively young. And then, again, I think he got really bad shrapnel wounds in his leg and got evacuated out to Malta. And Malta was then the most bombed place I think it's still got the record of being the most bombed, like, tiny piece of land for the highest length of time. And, but for him as a 19-year-old, and he was just like a Yorkshireman who grew up in the 20s and 30s, they would have they would have been lucky to get like 2 domestic holidays to the seaside a year. He then spent 5-6 years out in desert country. He was in Palestine for a bit, stranded on Malta. It's like it was the most interesting thing in his life by a mile, and he loved every minute of it. I mean, he was open about this, absolutely adored it. But when he came back, and keep in mind, his experience was very different. Yes, he was getting bombed, but he saw it as an adventure. If you were kind of stranded in a place where, like the other guy that I knew growing up who was in Italy, who never spoke about his experiences in World War II. He loved Italy, and I'm half Italian, so we had something to talk about. But he had a real joy of Italy and its people, but he never spoke about the military side of it because he was haunted by it. And many people were, and this is, again, I know this from the people that I spoke to, post World War II, it was not spoke about. Like in Britain in the 50s, it was so traumatic. There was so much legacy trauma, and Britain didn't even get hit that badly by it, comparatively speaking. We didn't get invaded, we didn't get occupied on the mainland, but people were still disturbed by it. People would see footage from World War II and it would cause massive anxiety attacks. Going right up into, for some people for the rest of their lives, but I think for society you're talking going up into the 60s. Things then started to change in this country in the 60s. So you started having things, and I remember this from watching reruns as a kid. We had programs like Dad's Army. We had things like Steptoe and Son, where they'd kind of openly talk about the war. And I think, especially Dad's Army, I think that helped to almost to kind of reevaluate the war and because it's a comedy, right? And if you've never watched Dad's Army, it's well worth seeking out because it's very, very funny. It's just about the Home Guard in Britain and the antics that they get up to. And, it's a wonderful show. And I think it was therapeutic to a lot of extents. Then, when that therapy, through osmosis kind of filters down into society, we then got the 70s. And in the 70s, there was this massive, obsession with World War II. You can see it everywhere. If you watch films there, read books, listen to music in the 70s, it just became a real important facet again. People were obsessed by it. And I'm talking about the youth. So people born in the 50s who were then in their 20s, and it caused this massive explosion in revisionist histories. And part of this revisionist history was to sell what the Nazis were selling, that they were supermen. And I don't know if the West did this as look how great we were, that we defeated this amazing power. I think that's probably it. But truth be told, the German machine, the Nazi forces, whatever you want to say, they lost the war very, very early on. I mean, I think there are several things in World War II where you can just point to and say, okay, yeah, that's exactly the moment where Hitler lost the plot. But there's this assumption, and we get this even today. I mean, a few years ago, I remember looking on in horror as I was flicking through the channels one day, and I came across a program called Hunting Hitler, something like that. It was an utter trash fire. I watched one episode of it, and I wouldn't do this, but I almost wrote a complaint letter to, it's Discovery Channel or something, for the absolute garbage that they are pushing on there. Basically just conspiracy theory nonsense. But it wasn't the show. It wasn't did Hitler escape and go and live in South America, which is kind of the premise of the show. And they kind of do this really bad investigation. They get these hacks and frauds involved to go and kind of chase people down and try and make stories where there are no stories. It's just a mess. it's not that I have a problem with. That in of itself is just silly entertainment. Where I had a problem is in the clear and obvious like respect and adoration that these hacks had for the Nazis. You can see it all the time. It's like they're like salivating when they're close to thinking that they're finding Hitler. It's like, oh, we're going to find the Fuhrer's bones or something. I mean, just horrific. Really bad optics. I mean, I can't believe that show got commissioned. It's one of many. So I think that's probably the worst. I've seen other ones as well. Like there's things like Nazi super weapons, telling us how like the Nazis were light years in front of us in all facets of technology. Well, that's nonsense. They were in front on rocketry, right? That's why, you know, post World War Two, and I mean, it's one of the great shames of Western society, but I kind of understand why they did it. But during the Nuremberg trials, the Americans literally took war criminals out of their cells and threw them over to America to kind of head up their scientific programs in rocketry. It's what got us to the moon, effectively. I mean, that's a massive tangent. I'm not going to even go off on this one, but just trust me when I say, like, you know, a lot of Nazis who were responsible for horrific things were completely given a blank check and allowed to get away with it and were patriated into American society because they were seen as useful. So there were facets of it that they were very good at. But their system, their culture was so intrinsically rotten that, I mean, and this is famously demonstrated over and over again. I mean, one of the famous ones, to me the most famous one, but probably because I'm British, when the Brits got defeated in France and we were evacuating at Dunkirk, the reason why they could have just obliterated the entire British army, you know, killed and captured all of it, plus all our equipment, everything else, and we had to leave most of our equipment there. But, you know, the Brits ended up getting, about 350,000 people off those beaches. We saved our army, effectively. Had that not have been the case, I think it would have been a very, very different war with a very different outcome, because we wouldn't have the security to fight the war in the Empire like we did, which is where we kind of were able to grind the Nazi war machine down and get them to fight on multiple fronts, that kind of thing, and the Japanese as well, obviously. But when they were surrounded at Dunkirk, there was some kind of like, there was competition and problems within the German hierarchy. Because they were Nazis and because they were idiots, they didn't put the order in to go and destroy the British forces. And this bamboozles historians right up to this day. You know, it's like, why on earth did they do that? Well, it's because the Nazis made horrible decisions. They were led by, and beyond all the horror and evil of Hitler, he was an incompetent corporal. You know, it's the reason why he never rose further up the train in World War One is because he wasn't very bright, he wasn't very talented, but he was a wonderful political manoeuvrer. I mean, if you look at the way that Hitler got into power is way more interesting than the Hitler of World War Two. And you've got to give him credit for this. Like, the manoeuvres that he did were absolutely Machiavellian first rate. Everything was against the Nazi party as well. You know, they didn't have the numbers in the German parliament, but they used democracy to kind of defeat democracy. So again, as evil as it was ruthless and Machiavellian to the extremity. But a war leader, Hitler was not, made just absolute bamboozling, stupid decision after stupid decision. I mean, I've already talked about one with like Dunkirk. The other ones are obvious, you know, like basically ignoring Operation Sea Lion after the defeat at the Battle of Britain, and then basically operating under the proviso that they were going to go and invade Russia during Operation Barbarossa and defeat them. That was never going to happen, you know, like, just has no understanding of how like warfare works in continental Europe, and clearly didn't read up on that. Then kind of engaging with things like Stalingrad, which is really kind of the death knell for the Nazis. But I do think that the decision not to destroy the British Expeditionary Force at Dunkirk, that's where all the terrible decisions started. And those terrible decisions, it's not just because Hitler was a nincompoop and a fool, it's generally because that entire system is rotten to the core and did not give anyone any kind of impetus to go away and make good decisions, to work collaboratively. It was all done through this weird, like, Darwin process of, you know, oh, the cream will always rise to the top, and if you have to kill everybody on the way there, then so be it. That's, I mean, just as a philosophy, that is utterly stupid. It's really as stupid as the whole might is right philosophy, where it's like, oh, you know, I can beat my neighbour up, ergo my opinion's always going to mean more than theirs. That, again, going back to that soft power thing, that is not how human beings work. You can have all the industrial might, you can have the army, but if your power base comes from the threat of a gun to somebody's head, you will not last. I mean, I don't know how many times we have to learn this over history, and you think now states would start to get it, like, and we do in the West. Like, that's why our systems will always win when we're up against people like, you know, the modern day Russian state, which I think is a fascist state, the modern day Chinese state, which is veering on a fascist state. I mean, it's not, you know, I say veering, I mean, there's a massive argument to suggest that what they've done in, especially across Western China, that they've now kind of crossed that mark. But ultimately, these are brittle powers. They're based on things that have no real depth to them. Whereas, like, as all the problems that exist in, like, the Western world, we have got the rule of law. You know, yes, there is corruption. Yes, there are problems. But ultimately, there is a transparency. Ultimately, people will fight for our system because they know that the alternative is tyranny. You know, so it's something, that's what soft power really is. It's that persuasion over might. And that's why, again, if you go back into kind of World War II history specifically, the Nazis were, again, this is going to differ from what I'm going to talk about from the clans, because the clans did have the mass technological advantage. The Nazis didn't. The Nazis got the initial successes that they got militarily were down to the Blitzkrieg. So they were down to, like, this new form of warfare that was genius. You know, it was absolutely brilliant. It was, I mean, and we still operate on these edicts today. If you look back at the first Gulf War in, like, the early 90s, you know, Operation Desert Storm is seen as like a work of art for military. You know, like how they basically destroyed all the communication channels, literally just cut the head off the opposition's ability to do anything, to speak to each other. And just, like, methodically, just then, bang, 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 like, take your objectives, you've won. It's why, like, it's why the Russians have messed up so badly now in Ukraine, because they had probably a 2-week period to take Kyiv, and they failed. And now they don't have the soft power to keep it. They've also now lost the hard power. And that's something that the Nazis went through as well. And the Germans went through as well in World War II, that they were, you know, their initial build-up of arms and tanks and the industrial might, well, they didn't have the oil fields, the oil reserves. That's why they were fighting down in the, like, in the southern region of Russia, because they needed access to those oil fields. So it was something where they really started to run before they could walk, but they needed to run to get the early initiatives. That's why they were really doomed from the outset. And I think revisionist history, going back to that for a second, like in the 70s, was just these garbage ideas that, like, the Germans, that we were so lucky to beat them, and, you know, they were doomed from failure from the beginning. They really were. I mean, that entire system, which people obsess over because it was so horrifying and so brutal and so oppressive and so disgusting, but people look now and think, how did they buy into that? How did the populace buy into it? It's a real, like, enigma to modern people. I think that's why we really kind of fetishize it, and I think that all started in the 70s. Anyway, that's the kind of history part over. So let's get into the clans. The clans, I think, suffer from something very, very similar, but to emphasise that point, not what the revisionist historians were saying in the 70s. The clans did genuinely have way better tech than the Inner Sphere. The Inner Sphere had not only lost all the Star League tech, you know, like, they didn't know how to make that stuff anymore. They didn't have the warships. The clans had every single conceivable advantage. But, as I've spoken about on this channel numerous times before, I've done videos on it actually, in terms of that clan culture was rotten. It was a system based on basically eugenics programs. There was no kind of buy-in other than threat. So, it's not like, oh, you become part of this society, we will try better things. It was based on this really belligerent idea that, like, again, like the Nazis, really, this, like, supreme form of Darwinism, which is not how human beings operate. I just can't believe people think this. Like, I'm from an anthropological background, so I've studied things like, I've not only studied human beings, but you study things like communities of chimpanzees. Chimpanzees are very, very aggressive, especially against other like groups of chimps, but they work collaboratively. If one member of their society is like ostracized, other members of the society will try to bring them back in, especially across the male populace, because they need those males in order to fight off other chimps, defend their territory, defend their food sources. And that's exactly how human beings work. That is what the concept of a human society or a nation is. It's that we collectively work together to kind of create those safety nets for people that need them, while, defending our patch and saying, like, it's like in Britain, like, we can openly say, well, we've got a shared community, we've got, we speak the same language, we've generally speaking got the same values. If someone just came in and just implanted their society on top of us, there would be an insurrection. We wouldn't be happy about that, as no country would. So, and that's why when I see these like Darwinist principles, I'm like, nature by itself, nature looked at in its raw form, is not humanity, right? We are evolved as part of that process, but we are not dictated to it. We've evolved our own culture and society, and we know when things work and when things don't work. It's not, we don't have to just be thinking, well, I'm just going to have to go and murder my neighbour to get his stuff, right? Because and that's ultimately, that's why my kind of opinion on this is that law and order are the prerequisites to any of the success here, because that's the thing that undermines and underpins successful society. Like, you can argue, okay, well, there's a degree of threat to that. So if you break the law, you can be penalised or punished for that. But ultimately, it's the only thing keeping all the checks and balances, and it's the law and order that is intrinsically important to this. And clan culture had, well, it does have law and order, but it's effectively a dictatorial state, ruled over by a warrior caste and a science caste. So straight away there are a lot of red flags there. But ultimately, again, they did differ from the World War II Nazi state on the grounds that they were very much in front of the Ionosphere massively. Like I said, the Ionosphere had not only forgotten the Starleague era tech, they'd lost all that, not developed on it. The clans had done the absolute opposite. They'd taken Starleague era technology and really improved it. So when the clan invasion started, they cut through in the first 3 waves of it. I think they just cut massively through the Ionosphere, as you see in those maps. When you've got the 4 invasion forces just completely cutting those like massive triangles right through Fedcom and Draconis Combine and Rasselhag space. But the theory then, so why do I think then that the industrial side of it is secondary to the cultural side of it, or the soft power side of it? So the first point is hubris. And hubris is very much associated with the clans. I don't think this would always come up. If anyone was going to give analysis of this, they would talk about the arrogance of the clans. There were multiple clans. There were like, in that time period, I think of the main clans, there were like 20 something. They decided though that they only needed 4 to invade, because they basically just underestimated the Ionosphere massively, and their not so much Ionosphere soft power at that juncture, but certainly the logistical side of it. And the fact that to get into the Ionosphere, they'd have to go from the outer periphery right down through to Terra, and then create the supply lines off the back of that. And as good as the clans were, they weren't that good. And if they'd have had any sense, they'd have done it as quickly as possible. And the planning they did for it should have encompassed all the clans. If they'd have gone in with all 20 clans, as opposed to the ridiculous honour system that they've got, where they wanted 4 to go on the main operation, then they held several clans back in reserve. Those reserve clans did come into play eventually, you know, like Diamond Shark and Nova Cat and Clan Steel Viper. But in the initial period, it was just Clan Wolf, Clan Smoke Jaguar, Clan Jade Falcon, and Clan Ghost Bear. And ruled by the Ilkhan, who was the Ilkhan of the Smoke Jaguars. But that, to me, the second that was decided, the second that they've decided that only 4 clans were going to invade, that's the moment they lost the war. So they lost the war from the get-go. It wasn't because of industrial might. That was the main factor. Ridiculous thing to do. Very, very silly. The second thing, and this kind of ties into that previous point as well, because I did mention it, there was a ridiculous clause put into the clan invasion, because clans, that said that the power that won Terror, so the clan force that took Terror, would then get right to be the Ilkhan. This was monumentally stupid, as was demonstrated, because from that second on, you've then got your 4 clans. You know, basically they've got the spearhead now. They know where they've got to go. They know what they've got to do to get the prize. And the clans saw that, again, going back to that extreme Darwinist philosophy of, well, we'll just get the strongest will out, and all that kind of thing. Instead, you had the clans then just not only refusing to work with each other, but openly working against each other to try and stop the other getting that. And you found this just constantly throughout the clan invasion, that those... And they already hated one another anyway. You know, like Clan Wolf and Clan Jade Falcon hated one another. I think Clan Smoke Jaguar basically hated everybody. Ghost Bear, I suppose, out of those 4 powers, were the least belligerent. I mean, they were a Crusader clan. I think eventually they did turn into... They did swap out from being a Crusader clan, I think, if memory serves me right. But they were still kind of chomping at the bit to have a go at the Inner Sphere. But they weren't... They're probably the chillest of the clans. So they don't really kind of factor in here. But certainly the others did not like one another. You then have this that unhealthy competition then, coupled with the massive lack of respect for the opposition. And so those two things combined are bad enough. And I've already hinted at the other problem, which again ties into hubris, but it's the logistic issues. So if you've got these supply chains just running back light year upon light year, and you're not really kind of garrison your worlds properly. So the way that clan military structure works is that you have kind of a frontline fighting force, which is incredible. 1 star of clan mechs with their power and their piloting abilities, which are superior to the Inner Sphere forces, they will run rickshaw over most things in 30-50 Inner Sphere. To back that up, though, they've got the secondary units. The secondary units then are basically old warriors, and they're the ones that then populate garrisons and control worlds and things like that. And it depends on the clan power to kind of what ride you get. So if you're in Clan Wolf territory and you're an occupied, planet, you don't get treated that badly. Same with Clan Ghost Bear. If you're unlucky enough to be part of Smoke Jaguar, they'll probably turn you into... to be conquered by Smoke Jaguar, you'll probably get turned into a slave. Jade Falcon are less evil than the Smoke Jags, but not by much. So, mixed bag in terms of what you're going to have to put up with. But those factors combined are pretty heinous in terms of where... And like I was saying with the Nazis, the Germans really kind of lost World War II after several weeks, when they just, for whatever reason, didn't go in and destroy the British Expeditionary Force. The clans cutting themselves off at the kneecaps and creating these ridiculous clauses, that's what defeated them. The consensus is, and this is, again, definitely ties into it, but the consensus is that the clans lost the war when the clan Ilkhan, Leo Showers, was killed by the... well, it's quite famous, isn't it, that they had the big meeting on the bridge of the ship, and then they got suicide bombed by I can never remember her name, Myronberg, can't remember how you say that, who was from the Rasselhag Republic. And when the Ilkhan was killed, so this kind of ties into my theory a little bit, because that was another point of clan culture. When the Ilkhan was killed, there was a year of peace, and the clans basically ran away to suck their thumb and complain and, you know, nasal gaze for a year while they decided on another leader, giving the Innisphere a year of prep time to kick into function all that new technology and salvage that they got from the clans. The Free Worlds League then became the big industrial centre, churning out everything because they were untouched by the war. And lo and behold, by the time the clans came back for what I think will have been wave 4 or wave 5, they had no chance. And then you had the genius of Vogt, who basically, you know, lulled the clans in, studied them, got them to kind of battle it out at Tukiid, where they were just absolutely trounced and the Innisphere were victorious, and used clan culture against them. Again, I'd go back through that point, that the whole thing which Fox was doing was completely based on his ability to see through the problems of clan culture, because he understood the two-dimensional aspect to it. He knew how to play them, and ultimately he knew how to defeat them through that culture. The industrial side of it, yes, it was a factor, but ultimately speaking, it's something where I think the culture of the clans was never really conducive with what they were trying to do. If they'd have come back in a much more peaceful way, as, look, Innisphere, we're going to try and help you here, and anyone who disagrees is going to be put to the sword, kind of like what the Star League probably would have done. That was their ethos, like, you know, soft power over might, but might needed where necessary. We would have had a very different story here, you know, very, very different story. In fact, I mean, that would have been a fascinating, like a counterfactual in terms of how the clan invasion actually ended up. But it didn't. They decided to go in, you know, very, very hard and create basically what would have been a genocide against the Innisphere. They did think the Innisphere was backwards, and they hated it. They hated several aspects of, like, Innisphere culture. They thought it was weak. They were very much, again, the original BattleTech writers were very, very well up on their 20th century history. And the clans really are the Germans in, like, 1939, 1940. But they are the Germans with that revisionist spin. So they're the Germans with amazing tech, which the Germans never had. That's, to me, a complete fallacy of history. But for the clans, they did have that, but they were just utterly defeated by the hubris of their own garbage culture. And it's why, I mean, I can never get into the clans. Like, no matter how much I try, and it's not a real world thing. It's just, and I love them because of this. They are just so alien and belligerent and awful in every respect of the world. I mean, I don't like any of them. Like, I know you'll get a lot of people who are like, oh yeah, I quite like Clan Ghost Bear. You'll never really hear that from me. I mean, I call Clan Ghost Bear Clan Ghost Bearable, right? Because I think that's how most people perceive it. It's like, well, they're the lesser of all the evils of the clans. Yes, I suppose that's true, but they're still awful. It's still a rotten culture, you know, and that culture's like that. And we're seeing this at the moment with Russia. I am absolutely sure in my lifetime we'll see it with China. No matter how much you oppress people, no matter how much you put a gun to their head and tell them they have to do it, you cannot win that in the long run. And I think clan culture it's kind of an interesting theory, really. And I've heard other people across the BattleTech community talk about this. There is an outlet for clan culture, and that's the bandit caste. And maybe that's why they survive to some extent, because they do allow people to buy out of their culture. You can't buy out of Chinese culture. Right, I mean, you can go and live in another country, but you can't go and, like, if you're if you're somebody the Chinese government doesn't like, you are going on a list somewhere. You know, if you're in Russia now and you're speaking out against the war, you're arrested. There is no counterpoint of view. It's believe what the state says, or the state will come and get you. And the clans, again, they are not that bad because they do have a buyout system. But there's still a system that promotes eugenics. There's still a system that promotes that weird, like, Darwin nonsense. Not Darwin's a genius, but I'm talking like the political notions that were born out of Darwinism, which I am certain Darwin would have absolutely despised. So, it's just they were never ever going to win it. It was something that, again, for me, the clans lost the invasion on day one. That decision, that let's just hold back because we think our opponents are useless. Well, they don't realise that their opponents, as much as it might suck to be a turnip farmer in the Lyran Commonwealth, or part of the underling warrior caste and soldiers of the Draconis Combine, better the devil you know. Right, and better that you're in that system where you understand the culture and everything else than this superimposed culture that will just see you as literal chattel, especially like with Clan Smoke Jaguar. I mean, they're very famous for it. If they get bondsmen, they just make them into serfs. Right, you don't get that across a lot of the other clans. A lot of the other clans will actually use them for their own ends. So if you get a good warrior, then you basically coerce them into becoming one of your, I don't know, a pilot for you or a soldier or something like that. So they've got this weird society where the society has a central aspect to it, and but then there are certain clans that just look so different from other ones. They're fascinating, and I love studying the clans and I love reading about them. Doesn't make me like them anymore though. I suppose it's the same for the people in the 70s writing about the Nazis. Like, you can put whatever like aspects of your kind of theories or whatever else on this, but it doesn't dismiss the reality. The clans were and are, I don't think it ever, and the Innisphere were useless as well to a lot of extents, but the clans were not some kind of, all supreme being that came from the outward of space. They were very, very damaged individuals in a heinous, horrible society. Much like fascism or the kind of hard end of communism. These are not good systems. They are terrible systems perpetrated by terrible people. And it's, bring this back to the real world for a second. It's our responsibility to kind of know our strengths and why is it our systems thrive and their systems just, it's literally got to be, you do what we say or we will put you in a concentration camp. But I don't know. Maybe this lesson is lost on people because they're a bit edgy and they're looking for some kind of counter to, the regular zeitgeist. But sometimes the regular zeitgeist exists because it is true. Anyway, that's my little theory. Anyway, so sum that up. Clan culture trumps the whole argument that quantity is a quality in of itself, which I do think that entire phrase now has lost its meaning, and it's just because we can't let go of World War II. We're still kind of entrenched in that notion of warfare in 1945 because World War II was huge. It was massively important. It was massively influential. But look at the difference now. The world now between now and 1945 is just unrecognisable. And warfare follows that suit. And the sooner that we all understand that and get into that mindset, the better. Because, and you still get it. You still get like people lobbying governments through like the industrial complexes, giving them really bad advice on like how to fight a modern war because their viewpoints are things that they read in the 70s and 80s, which just no longer apply. Anyway, not going to go off on any more tangents, so I will leave that here. I will thank you very much for watching. Just in terms of the next few weeks, I am on holiday in 2 weeks. Before that, I'm actually going to do quite a lot of recording with Death From Above. So we're doing the prep now for season 2. We've got a few videos to do before that I'm going to be involved with. So hopefully we'll record that all next week. So I don't know if I'm going to be able to do another video for a couple of weeks on this channel just because of commitments elsewhere and the holiday. I do want to do more of these like historical, they're not really counterfactuals, but like the counterfactual things are interesting. I do like asking that question. I see these questions come up a lot in the community as well, like what if the clans had have won in 3050? I might try do some more of that this year. Certainly want to do more of the historical analysis. So I love doing like, I mean, I've got one coming up, and I've actually, the video is already out there on the channel, but don't watch it because it's rubbish and it didn't record properly. And there's issues with it with the video. I never should have put it up really, but I'm going to re-record it and I'm going to build on it. And it's all about the Ares Convention and the Peace of Westphalia, because I do like that historical kind of analysis between the two things I really love, which is history and BattleTech. So to bring them both together, I hope you find that quite interesting as well. And I love, like, I know, like, you know, YouTube is what it is, and it's a bit of a funny old world on here, but I don't care about the numbers on here. I don't care about how many subscribers I get. I don't care about anything like that. What my intention on this place, through this channel, was just to kind of get a small group of like-minded, interesting and interested people where these debates can happen, and then I'll go away and think about it and maybe draw up more videos. And I just think that's quite a fun thing to do, and I don't care if it's 10 people that watch it and discuss it with me or 10,000. I love the BattleTech community is really special. I've met some wonderful people on here, and I have wonderful debates with you, whether it's in the comments here or on Twitter or privately or on forums or whatever. It's a real joy for me to do. So if you do comment, you'll see, if you ever commented on my videos before, I try to kind of get back to everybody. It might take me a few weeks sometimes to get back to everybody because I'm usually quite busy, but I love having those like debates. And as long as it's done like respectfully, then, I mean, disagree with me respectfully, I mean, then more than happy to do that. I don't particularly respond well to trolling. I do tend to close that down or start getting quite belligerent. I am Italian after all. I've got, you know, got a certain like, what's the word? I've got my spiciness to you know, to respect in that equation, and I'm not really a passive person, and I do tend to go for jugulars. As if you follow me on Twitter, you will see I've got no problems going after people on there and getting quite shouty. It's not really who I am. I do like to kind of operate a little bit of a troll online, just a little one, just a little troll. Anyway, I hope you found that interesting, and maybe there'll be another video next week. Depends if I get time to record it next week. But until then, thank you very much for watching, and I'll hopefully catch you again next time.